Everyone who's interested in Tesla or Sweden has probably heard that there's a bit of a kerfuffle going on between these two right now. What's it really all about? And who's right and who's wrong? Maybe I'm not gonna be able to answer that second question, but at least I can give you some insights into what's happened so far and why. There's a big strike going on right now in Sweden, and many companies have stopped delivering services to Tesla. This is one of the biggest labor conflicts in Sweden in recent years, and it's a pretty big issue for Tesla as well. Sweden is Tesla's fifth biggest market in Europe, so this isn't an insignificant strike in an insignificant country. Well, I guess it is pretty insignificant compared to the US market, but it still has a fair bit of impact. I'm recording this at the end of November 2023, so the situation could be completely different by the time I release this video. The conflict could already be resolved and everything could be back to normal, but I don't think that it will be. Why is that? Well, this isn't just a conflict regarding higher pay or more benefits. This is a clash of completely opposing ideologies. How did we end up in this situation? Well, let's start with a timeline of what's happened so far. First of all, let's start with the year 2018. That's when the Swedish industry union IF Metall started negotiating with Tesla regarding collective bargaining agreements. Sweden has around 50 unions, and IF Metall is one of the biggest ones, with 313,000 members. This negotiation between IF Metall and Tesla continued up until 2022. That's when Tesla finally said that, no, we're not gonna sign any collective bargaining agreements. This caused a lot of grumbling in Swedish factories, and on October 18, 2023, Tesla repair workers finally threatened to strike. However, back then it was still a pretty small conflict. IF Metall represents between 120 and 130 Tesla repair workers in 7 locations in Sweden. On October 27, these repair workers went on strike, but it wasn't very effective. Tesla threatened to bring in strikebreakers, and there were also reports that some repair shops were still open despite the strike. So on October 31st, IF Metall threatened to introduce more strikes if Tesla wasn't gonna take this first strike seriously. This led to a new meeting between Tesla and the IF Metall union on November 1st. IF Metall reported that they had a productive meeting, so things might appear to be going in the right direction by now. But appearances can be deceiving. On the 6th of November, there was another meeting between Tesla and IF Metall, but this time the verdict was that they would not reach an agreement. So on November 7, the situation escalated even more, with dock workers at 4 major ports in Sweden joining the strike. No new Tesla cars could now enter Sweden through the ports at Malmö, Gothenburg, Trelleborg and Södertälje. This made Tesla rejoin the negotiating table, but they also tried to sneak around the blockade by transporting Teslas to Sweden by land instead. Tesla has a very American way of approaching union conflicts. They try to bring in strikebreakers, they try to circumvent the blockades, and so on. This was not appreciated by the Swedish unions. On November 17, a lot of people joined in a sympathy strike against Tesla. Dock workers in all ports were now on strike, as well as cleaners, mechanics and electricians involved with Tesla. By now, the Tesla strike had escalated to a severe degree, and negotiations had broken down completely. Tesla refuses to sign the collective bargaining agreement on pure principle, and they believe that they can simply wait out the strike. However, the IF Metall union is paying all workers on strike, and they claim that they have enough cash to keep this going for another 500 years. The unions also reported that Tesla Sweden doesn't have the authority to sign anything, so there's not even a possibility to negotiate further. On November 23rd, Elon Musk tweeted, X'd, that the strike in Sweden is insane, a comment that got picked up by news outlets all over the world. However, it doesn't seem like the unions think that it's insane, because on November 24, another company decided to join the strike. Hydro Extrusions is a company that develops critical components for the Tesla cars, and now they also joined the strike. Then on November 27, Tesla decided to sue the Swedish transport agency and PostNord because they can't get any license plates for their cars delivered. They're apparently calling this a discriminatory attack directed at Tesla. I guess we'll see what happens with that lawsuit. At the time of this recording, that's the last thing that's happened in this conflict, but it probably won't be the last. But how did we end up like this? The main reason for the conflict is that Swedish unions want Tesla to sign a collective bargaining agreement, something that most big companies in Sweden do. Tesla, on the other hand, has a policy of never signing any union agreements, ever. Tesla's argument is that they already deliver better pay and better benefits than what the collective bargaining agreement demands. Most Swedes' response to that is pretty obvious. Well, if you're already fulfilling all the requirements, just sign the contract. Tesla's refusal to sign the contract leads to suspicion from the Swedes. If they refuse to play by the book, that's gotta mean that they have something to hide. Also, the collective bargaining agreements is about a lot more than just pay. In fact, salaries is one of the few things that this conflict isn't really about. The Swedish collective bargaining agreements also deal with, for example, pensions, working conditions, safety, and job stability. The union concerns at this time is mostly about working conditions and job stability, something that Tesla's responses aren't really addressing. It basically appears that there's a misunderstanding from Tesla regarding what the unions are really after. But there might also be a misunderstanding from the Swedes regarding why Tesla is so adamant about not signing an agreement. Tesla workers in the US have already tried to unionize, but that's failed so far. There's a mistrust of unions in the US, both from employers and from workers as well sometimes. And if Tesla were to sign a union agreement in Sweden, who knows where it might spread? For example, to the US, where Tesla is fighting so hard to keep them away. But why is it so important for the Swedes that Tesla signs this agreement? More than 70% of all workers in Sweden belong to a union. That's a pretty high number, especially compared to the US, where that figure is 11% instead. In the early 1900s, there were a lot of strikes in Sweden. The relationship between employers and employees had become very volatile, especially after 1909, when 300,000 people went on strike for a whole month. That was quite unimaginatively called the Big Strike of 1909, but more strikes followed after that one. The situation became unmanageable, and politicians sat down with representatives from both laborers and employers to try to find a solution. In 1938, they came up with Saltsjöbadsavtalet, the Saltsjöbad Agreements, and that defined the Swedish model. The model for what exactly? Well, the model for Swedish welfare, for Swedish business, and for the Swedish way of life. The Swedish model is unique and has paved way for the modern way of life in Sweden. It's a collaboration between unions and employer organizations where they decide salaries, vacations, pensions, working conditions, and a lot more among themselves without the state's intervention. One thing that surprises many people is that there's no legally defined minimum wage in Sweden. That's because it's defined in collective bargaining agreements between unions and employers instead. Swedish law dictates some things regarding, for example, working conditions and vacations, but in general, most of that is handled by unions rather than the state. And that's typically defined in collective bargaining agreements. Another thing that these collective bargaining agreements define is when you're allowed to strike and when you aren't. A company that has signed a collective bargaining agreement is protected from strikes to a much higher degree than a company that hasn't. That means that Tesla, ironically enough, is submitting itself to strikes like the one that's happening right now by not signing the collective bargaining agreement. If they had signed it, then the unions couldn't have gone on these massive strikes we see right now. In general, most Swedish workers, as well as companies, see these union agreements as a positive thing. It's just a pity that Tesla chooses to not fit in with this Swedish model. So what's gonna happen now? I'm just gonna make some uneducated guesses about the future. Will Tesla give in and sign a union agreement? That seems pretty unlikely. Will the Swedish unions give in and go back to work? Well, it's possible, but I don't think that we're there yet. This is a major conflict after all, a conflict between the Swedish model and a company that's ruled with an iron fist. It's basically a fight between collectivist and individualist values. One possible way out of this would be that Tesla decides to abandon Sweden. Sort of. Officially, Tesla could not have a company in Sweden, but they could have a subsidiary that handles Tesla's business under a different name. That company could then sign a collective bargaining agreement, and Elon Musk could still say that Tesla never signs union agreements. That's just my 20 öre about a possible way forward out of this complete mess. And that's about it for this very quick look at the conflict between Tesla and the unions of Sweden. I hope you found it interesting. Like and subscribe, but most importantly, have a great day. Oh, and I hope you enjoyed this look at the Mall of Scandinavia in the background. Now have a look at this video up here in the corner. You're gonna like it. I hope.